Muy bien, pues
Very well.
vamos.
So let's get started with our session of the day. This session is being recorded and is being transmitted with simultaneous interpretation. So everyone that is interested in listening to it in English, you can do so. And here's some logistic details that I'm going to leave on the screen so we can get to know them. So I'm going to start by giving you welcome to this workshop on good regulatory practice in Peru that has been organized as part of the regulatory convergence for medical devices inside the Standards Alliance Phase 2 initiative supported by United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and the American National Standards Institute, NC, as well as the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence for the Medical Technology Sector. We thank the support of all the speakers that will be with us today, specifically the Ministry of the Foreign Trade and Tourism, the DHMID and and the Chamber of Commerce. I'm Sandra Ligia Gonzalez. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Coalition. I have the honor of coordinating this session. We are committed with supporting the development of the competences that are required. Part is in all the stakeholders in the sector, from the public and private sector, to go further in the regulatory convergence with good regulatory practices. And as you know, convergence is key to ensure the patients in Peru have access to medical devices they need, as well as supporting the government in terms of the best use of its resources to meet the regulatory and sanitary responsibilities. Likewise, promotes the implementation of institutional levels of good regulatory practice, including the use of international standards, the public consultations, and the notifications to the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee of the World Trade Organization. And so now I will introduce and thank a lot to Sandra Stapleton, the president of Comsalud, who will give us a welcome message. Sandra, the floor is yours. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for the invitation. I think this session will be productive to all of you. Because of the virtual aspect, I see that we have to be brief, so my message will be very quick just to open this important course to all of us. So good morning to all parties that are here, the representatives of the Inter-American Coalition and the institutions that are participating. Considering this is a course of good regulatory practices, it is important to ensure the quality, the safety, and the use of the medical devices. And they are key to ensure an efficient health system with focus on standards to reduce regulatory requirements that may be doubled and that impact on the good health of the population. Likewise, it will help define the standards in the cost and benefit analysis with the analysis of all the performance and all the application of standards. This is happening between sanitary agencies and companies to make sure the communication is easier, and so it will improve the competitiveness in health with the universality to reach a harmonized regulatory convergence and to meet international agreements. We hope the course is productive and takes all the doubts you can have in terms of medical device regulations. Thank you, Sandro, for your message. And now we are all aligned in the purpose that will serve the population of Peru, and they will be also useful for the regulators to facilitate the access to safe medical devices that perform as planned. And of course, the collaboration of all the stakeholders is key to really meet such objectives. So thank you, Sandro, for your words. And now let's start according to the agenda you have on the screen. And our first session we'll have Renata Amaral, who will present the global perspective of the good regulatory practices. Renata is the director of the Summer Law Program of World Trade Organization and the U.S. Trade Department, together with the American University of Washington, for the development of and investment in international trade, and she's the founder of the organization Women Inside Trade that strengthens the community of international trade and gives visibility to the excellent work developed by women in this field, as well as being the technical secretariat of the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence for the medical devices, for GRP and TBT, among other functions. She has doctor degree by the University of Maastricht, and she has a doctor degree in law by the University of Santa Catarina in Brazil, and master degree in international law by the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. So Renata, the floor is yours. Thank you, Sandra. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry for my Spanish. I'm Brazilian and I live in Washington, D.C. I work with the coalition and we are very happy to be. Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen. Just a minute.
Parece que sí. Entonces, si quieres yo proyecto, sin problema.
Yo creo que es porque está en full screen.
I believe it's because it's in full screen. Let me try again.
Voy a intentar otra vez, Sandra, y si no.
And if I can't, I'll ask you to do it. Okay, so we got it.
Sí, ¿no?
Sí, perfecto.
Perfecto. Entonces, este taller
So this workshop is intended to each of the countries that are part of the coalition. We are 10 countries, and the idea has come up in the past year to have a moment to share knowledge with stakeholders from the government, from the private sector and the academia, to promote this space of conversation between the important stakeholders and promote networking and produce knowledge together. So I'm going to introduce one of the focus of the coalition, which is how to make international trade and regulators speak the same language. And so we bring some of the good regulatory practices, a little about international trade, and we want to show that we are working with that aspect every day, because it's important for you to know how regulatory practices work, how can you develop convergence and in terms of regulation, and why it is important to have these alliances between countries, especially for medical device sector. It is very important because it is a long production chain with several countries involved, as you know better than me. So a certification can change a whole procedure for import and export. New regulation can impact and cause lots of costs to some activities of international trade activity. So we want to show how important it is for all of us to be on the same page, to talk about trade best practices, and that's why we have experts after my presentation from the government, from the private sector, who will tell you a little about how the tools in Peru and the news in Peru, and how the private sector can help the government in Peru and vice versa, how the government can help the the private sector. So the idea is not teaching so much rather than exchanging knowledge and producing joint knowledge. So this is the starting point of a relationship, and we in the coalition are here to facilitate and support with whatever you may need. So we are going to start by saying what are good regulatory practices, and you are going to see that my presentation is an introduction to both days of discussion we will have. So this term is about the quality and the consistency of the national regulation process. So it's a national process. Here we're not talking about international processes yet. It's an internal process for the countries. So it has to do with the internal coordination and the review process under which a whole government works to ensure the rules and regulations are developed in an open and transparent participative way, and that the results are based on the risk and on the best data available. So good regulatory practice is an internal process for a country. So good regulatory practices are not about creating new, more or less regulation, rather than facilitating best results. So I'm not talking about creating a new standard, a new law. We are talking about facilitating the regulatory results and the regulations that already exists, but for the next ones, for the next political processes that use some paths, but good regulatory practices is a professional process to develop the rules that have a political course. And together with that, you have a process of transparent and participative regulation development and based on evidence. You're going to listen to us talking a lot about that. The evidence-based decision and the importance of the transparency and the participation of all stakeholders that are involved in the regulatory process. Good regulatory practices are an important precursor for the regulatory cooperation. And when I talk about this cooperation, we are talking about a process that may be international. The results, the regulatory results in quality can only benefit if they use the opportunity of regulatory cooperation. So here I bring the definition of cooperation and convergence because they are not so, the difference is not so obvious or not so clear for those who don't work with that on their day-to-day. So I have talked about good regulatory practices, an internal process, a national process that involves the internal institutions of a country, and the cooperation is any interaction between regulators of different countries, and it results in any kind of cooperation aiming at increasing efficiency, the time to meet the regulatory results that are desired. So cooperation is a first step to reach convergence, which is what I'm going to mention ahead. So cooperation is called international cooperation because it happens between regulators of different countries that may not result in a same standard, a same rule, but may get to some kind of cooperation, an understanding or an interpretation that may be the same between two or more countries, but always aiming at increasing efficiency, the time to get to the regulatory results. So cooperation is a term that we listen a lot because of the pandemic, and regulatory and international cooperation is a topic that is very important for several sectors of the economy in the world, but for medical devices specifically even more, because it is a sector that is directly involved with the pandemic, is a sector that has the production chain touching several countries and has several different products. And all of that may impact if we don't have good regulatory practices, we don't have a level of international cooperation between countries. And so what is regulatory convergence? We are the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence. So convergence is a way of cooperation, but it's a little deeper when different countries decide to change their regulatory frameworks, their existing frameworks, to take them to a closer alignment. It is a level beyond a simple cooperation, and it can happen over time, but at the moment of the regulation in the respective countries is sometimes independent and hard to synchronize. So in the coalition, because we are working with different countries, different levels of good regulatory practices, and different levels of international cooperation with other countries, we have worked a lot with step by step to work with the countries inside the coalition to understand their systems and how we can help and try to show that there are mechanisms that should be used by the countries, but also to let the private countries, the private sectors and the academia, the system they already have in their country, because the countries may have regulatory practices that are examples to the world. So we try to make everyone talk between themselves. So in each country, we know how the regulatory practices happen and how the private sector and us as coalition can help this understanding and help to implement more modern processes and more converging with these world standards that are adopted all around the world. The whole idea in convergence is creating less regulation and use the same regulation, the same standard for a same product, the same chain of production. So the idea is facilitating the trade, converge what exists in different countries. And for that, we are trying to make this work by country and try to help and make all the stakeholders to talk and understand what they do.
And here I have a regulatory process model. Of course, there's a lot of them. I'm from Brazil. And for example, this model can be applied, but there's a lot of steps that are not, that are between each steps that are not reflected in this specific model. But this is a very simple model for life cycle of the regulations. So identifying the need and having clear goals for the regulation, getting data and comments for all the interested groups, I mean, all the stakeholders that are going to actually be affected by this new regulation, by these new rules, design of the actual regulation. So, getting data and comments, listening to what the private sector is saying, the academy, everyone who's interested, designing the regulation, applying this regulation, and evaluating the regulatory impact as well. And I believe tomorrow we're going to have a panel that is going to talk a lot about new tools in Peru to evaluate regulatory impact analysis. So we are going to have a little bit more detail on each step during these 2 days, specifically when we talk about Peru. And the regulatory cooperation, as I was saying, the international cooperation can happen during any of these steps. So during the design of a regulation, during monitoring, when you're observing or managing, doing the ex post management of the analysis or regulation. So it's very difficult that it's going to be successful if we're not going to have the application of good regulatory practices. So this is something that is very clear to us, actually. And we do have a lot of close interaction with the World Trade Organization, and it has been working with this international corporation topic, for a very long time, even now more strongly related to the pandemic. And it's very clear that if countries don't have good regulatory practices in their own domestic and national systems, it will be very challenging for all of this to be able to be integrated in one international cooperation system for regulations like we have in other countries. So we always say we should aim and look at what we have inside each country, so then we can check for larger cooperation and convergency. After my presentation, Dr. Claudia Rosas is going to talk a little bit more about Peru specifically in this sense. So how Peru is functioning in this world, having several challenges to commerce, and we're going to talk a little bit about good regulatory practices. So I am getting prepared. I'm getting you ready for Claudia's presentation, which is going to be a little bit more specific about Peru. So good practices and cooperation. The implementation of good practices is a significant step towards cooperation. And since good regulatory agreements will have less challenges, less cross-border challenges. And now we talk a little bit about international commerce. What are the key components of good regulatory practices? Transparency and participation of the stakeholders. So when I say the participation of these stakeholders, I'm talking specifically about public consultations, public research. So whenever a government is thinking of new regulation, it is very important for this process to be transparent and for it to have enough room for public consultation so that all the interested people can be participated in the process. Using qualitative data and solid science, this is very important in a good practices process where decisions need to be based on evidence and solid science and qualitative data. A focus based on risk. So this is also a very important pillar of good regulatory practices. So focusing on a new regulation that is going to be decided on domestic environment should also be risk-based and evidence-based. The importance of evaluating the regulatory impact. I believe we're going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow in tomorrow's session, but the evaluation of regulatory impact is extremely important. During the process that we are doing, considering regulation, but also the evaluation after the implementation of the regulation. And in this case, the evaluation also has to consider an economic evaluation, economic impact for the regulation on the affected sector. So during the process and after the process as well, proposed, after the implementation of the regulation. So analysis for the competence and international impact. This part of international impact is something that we have been talking a lot in the coalition. We have been talking a lot about how important it is for companies to have integrated systems that are going to consider the international impact for a standard. And when I say international impact, I'm talking about regulations that can impact international commerce in general related to products. And then again, this is a sector that has a lot of different products. There are a lot of products that go through production phases in different countries. So in each country, there will be a different process. And it is important for us to consider the international impact for that regulation and what that will cause. The function of standards and the evaluation of conformity. So trying to consider in this process, not only the regulation, but also standards and conformity evaluation procedures, ex post evaluation, like I was saying, and an organ for central coordination. We don't have this in all countries. We don't have it in Brazil, for example. but it is something that it is aimed, it's something that is ideal. So it's definitely a goal. All the organs that are creating regulations, they want to be coordinated by a central organ, always trying to consider the coordination that we're going to have of all the good regulatory practices process in the country. Not only one agency or a specific ministry, but we want it to be a process that is coordinated among all of the authorities in the country, the specific country we're talking about. The evaluation of regulatory impact. So the good practices, this is something that I actually highlighted in the good regulatory practices process, because this is one of the most important parts on a good regulatory practices process. So the good regulations anticipate the impact that they will have in the market. They project the benefits, specifically the economic benefits and the economic impacts as well, that a specific regulation is going to have on the market costs. So the evaluation of regulatory impact is a part of the process that we pay a lot of attention to, because it does impact the domestic market as well as the international market many times. The good practices guide the efforts of regulators to be able to calculate and better calculate costs and benefits according to, the elaboration of guides and the methodology, and developing a common methodology that is going to be used for all regulatory authorities. And one of the things that we have been reviewing in the countries that we've been working with is this: if we have guides for the elaboration of good regulatory practices, if there are central guidelines that are used for all agencies and ministries, the regulatory authorities, or no, if it's something different for each one. So it's different for each agency. So it's one of the things that we do check a lot in the coalition. How is the process working internally? Is it a totally spread out process, or is it a coordinated process between the countries, or also inside one country? Here I have highlighted 3 countries in the region that have good regulatory practices processes that are very interesting, because, and I say that because they are now signing chapters for good regulatory practices that are specific in their new international commerce agreements. This is a trend for the whole world, I believe. Good regulatory practices walk in parallel with the technical barriers to trade. So companies that I have highlighted: United States, Brazil, and Ecuador. United States have created a new agreement with Mexico and Canada with a specific chapter for good regulatory practices. And they also have interesting sector chapters in this agreement. And the United States have signed with Brazil and with Ecuador specific chapters for good regulatory practices as well. I am paying attention to this, and I want to highlight this because these are chapters that highlight, for example, the need of creating a specific web page which is unified by this, the country's central government about regulatory practices. There is a need for, previous planning of rules. It also highlights the importance of looking towards the future and trying to have a central organ for regulatory coordination, highlighting the quality of information, using simple language, the importance of being transparent, the evaluation of regulatory impact, reviewing retrospectively a rule that was already implemented, good regulatory practices committees. And these are all elements that are included in those chapters that were signed between these countries that should be a trend on the commerce agreements that we'll be seeing, today and as we move forward. So I think it's one of the great topics of the most modern agreements of international commerce. International forums, the importance of participating on international forums for developing standards. We have a lot of members of the coalition that we check this. So IMDRF, PH, PAHO. We have a lot of different committees related to medical devices. So there's a lot of companies, there's a lot of countries that are part of this coalition that want to be a part, and we want them to sit on the table with these forums to check how it works. I believe Peru is in a lot of different forums, and this has allowed, of course, I'm going to leave it for the next panelists, but Peru has participated in many different forums, and we're going to hear how Peru has been acting today and tomorrow as well. And here I'm going to go towards the end of my presentation, and I would like to talk a little bit about the interface between good regulatory practices and international commerce. Over the last few years, we have paid attention to the increase in commercial costs related to regulatory divergences. So this is related, I always say when I teach my international commerce history classes, I usually mention that today the main problem of regulatory commerce is not fees or taxes. It's actually regulatory divergencies that are more and more, present in different countries. So sanitary obstacles, economic obstacles that can be justified or not according to the World Trade Organization. But the fact is, regulatory divergencies are a very big problem, and it's very concerning, more concerning than fees and taxes. Today, when we're taking services and what property being taken across borders, and that is really raising costs. The biggest problems that we have, for sure, are related to regulatory differences between countries. And just an overlook on international treaties. I'm going to give you an introduction on these technical barriers to trade, and I'm going to leave it to Dr. Claudia Rosas to talk about it more. But the technical barriers to trade agreement has been an instrument. So it's an agreement that is included inside the agreements of the World Trade Organization. And it is an agreement that works as an instrument to be able to thrust and lead members to use measures that are not as bad for commerce, to try to harmonize the use of relevant international standards. It talks about transparency. I'm going to talk a little bit more about transparency as we go on. And it is also a mechanism to avoid commercial disputes related to standards and technical regulations. So here we have a committee on World Trade Organization. There's a separate meeting for good regulatory practices. If you guys don't know, on the coalition, the first panel that we have participated as coalition has been on the good regulatory practices session of the World Trade Organization in 2020, February 2020. So we are paying a lot of attention to what they are doing to be able to help the countries, but also to be in constant communication as well. Right, and here, to be able to finish, I would like to talk a little bit about EPING, which is a system for transparency. As I said, one of the pillars of this agreement is transparency. Why am I talking about transparency so much? World Trade Organization has 164 members. Transparency is in everyone's interest. So we want our partners, our commercial partners, to be transparent. We have to be transparent as well as a member of the organization. So EPING is a warning system where you're able to subscribe to receive notifications via email about the revisions that are going to be done on regulations related to specific products and or markets that are in your interest. So EPING is free, and anyone can subscribe in the system and receive these notifications for products and for countries in their interest. The information services for technical barriers to trade follow a lot of guidelines from the World Trade Organization, as I was saying, and it can help you follow and approach these questions related to future regulations. So it is a page of administration dedicated to government officials that are related to transparency in terms of sanitary measurements and or phytosanitary measures, and of course the OTC. So I have e-paying, and everyone in the equalization does have it as well, because we want to receive information from other countries in the specific sector of medical devices. Here I have kind of a view of the page for you to check, but I'm going to connect on the page so you guys can see how it works. But before that, well, here it's in general, but I will come back to this. In the page, you can select the members, so from where you want to receive notifications. If you want to have notifications for sanitary and phytosanitary measures, you can have that, or technical barriers to trade for all, from which year to what year, name of specific products, keywords. So all of this is available and it's free so that anyone can go in and use it. I will go back to this before we move on to the next panel with Claudia. And now to finish, some other mechanisms that are available in the World Trade Organization. And I know that Dr. Claudia is going to talk a little bit more about this. So revision of commercial policies for countries. These do happen usually every 2 to 4 years, maybe 6 years, depending on the level of the economy and the economic development of a country. Specific commercial concerns, it's a mechanism to present concerns that we may have with the regulation in another country. So this can be during the meetings of the OTC committee, so the technical barriers to trade, and the last resource of the organization, and it's not that interesting for many years. So you guys are going to receive this presentation, all of our presentations, and before I finish, I would only like to show you the e-pink page so that you guys can see it, just quickly.
You can see it, right? So here, the page is in English, French, and Spanish. And here you have a page that counts all the regulations, notifications of countries. That's why I talk so much about the system, because it's a voluntary system for the members of the WTO to use it for consider the proposals for future regulations and provide some time, give the opportunity for all the other members of the WTC, the WTO to comment about it. So you can contact the pink page. You can see the World Trade Organization, the International Trade Center, and the United Nations are all parts. And you can look for something, you can receive some warnings. And for instance, I can choose the members of the WTO who I want to receive notifications from. If I want all of them or the ones related to SPS or to TBT, I can consider the date of distribution, the products related, the objectives. I can define my goals to use and filter my system. So here we are all learning more all the time about the system, understanding how it works. And because it's a voluntary system of transparency, it's important for all of you to use it, but it's not a mandatory system. It's just a recommendation. It would be important for all the members to use the system, because transparency is one of the rules, one of the pillars and principles of the organization. But we know there are several levels of use and non-use of the system by different countries, sometimes because of a lack of knowledge of how it works or how you can use it. So Sandra, I think this is it. That's what I have from my part. And maybe we have some time for questions, maybe. Thank you, Renata, for your presentation. We haven't received any questions, and you can use the Q&A session on the bottom. So all participants can use the possibility of sending your questions via Q&A. I have a hand raised. I don't know if you want to make a question. I have Imeda Lavado, and if you want to say something, you can help us by doing it through the Q&A so we can read it, but it seems important, the information that you shared, Renata, something that is key, which really you emphasized, that has to do with the knowledge of all the tools and knowing the obligations of different countries in terms of good regulatory practices and the need and the opportunity that we all have of learning, incorporating the knowledge, and more than incorporating them, knowing how to have all the stakeholders have it as a day-to-day activity. We know that our obligations inside the countries to publish regulations, so we have the opportunity of commenting the proposals that are generating the regulations, not only locally as well as internationally. Countries can collaborate and contribute for local regulations to be closer, to be more converging, and allow us to definitely reach the processes that this year, particularly the World Health Organization, has emphasized, because the regulation and the reliability is very important. The reliance practices are important. So all stakeholders need the knowledge and the tools at hand to be able to collaborate. Sandro, I don't know if you have some comments. No, I'd like just to congratulate Renata, because I think your presentation has been very clear, and everything you mentioned, and specifically about the EPIN page, is really important. You know, I'm going to be the first one to subscribe. I'm going to confess I have never accessed it before. And the saying that you said is very interesting. It's not just mention the barriers for the trade, but also the convergence that exists. So that's what we have been trying to do over the past 15 years to reduce fees and barriers. And what we want is to have clarity in the commerce. And so the alliances help a lot with sanitary registrations as well. So it's important for authorities to listen to what we are saying here. Sandra, the word aranceles in Spanish was missing. What I mentioned was the tariffs and the fees. Yes, and this is the main problem for international trade since the creation of the WTO. Before the WTO, we had the agreement of fees since the Second World War. We've had rounds of negotiations of the fees and of tariffs, but not of more technical aspects. And now the tariffs are lower worldwide after the WTO, and now the problem is really regulatory divergence, not only tariffs. It's true, and allow me to say that here we have products with zero tariff, and so this is really not the barriers we have today. Thank you. Now we have some questions. Sheila Perez asks us, do we have any standard or international guideline about good regulatory practices? What we have inside the agreement of technical barriers to trade, there are some good regulatory practices. There isn't an agreement for this good regulatory practice, but what we have is something I consider a trend of the country-to-country trade agreements to have a chapter dedicated to good regulatory practice. It has started with the US, Mexico, and Canada, but you have the Trans-Pacific partnerships and great agreements that have been negotiated. Not all are effective so far because of Trump and all that, but they have discussed good regulatory practices and issues more related to the importance of looking at it as a trade issue and something more current, more up to date to trade than other issues as tariffs or something else. So it's going to be more present regarding international trade and labor rights, environmental aspects. So these are the great topics that will be more present. There isn't an international agreement on good regulatory practices, but there are the the OECD guidelines. So the OECD guidelines are the base for everything that happens in terms of regulatory practices inside countries in a domestic level. So OECD has guidelines, has something related and similar with the WTO and WHO that is related to both organizations. So what we have are some guidelines, but there isn't something mandatory. That's what I want to say. Thank you, Renata. And to complement your answer, all the participants and the general audience can access all that information via the coalition website. On our website, we have published the guidelines of good regulatory practices that the WHO has recently published, and we also have them in non-official translations into Spanish and Portuguese. We know often the language barrier limits the possibility of incorporating information and processes to the practices of the region. So we have the task as a coalition to do that, and we hope the World Health Organization to publish them officially in Spanish and Portuguese, but so far you have the non-official translations on our website, as well as information that Renata mentioned related to the good regulatory practices published by the OECD and the World Trade Organization, and also the technical barriers to trade agreement. And so the link is on the web, on the chat here on Zoom, so you can access to all of that. Thank you, Renata. We have other questions. Sarah Ribas asks, in your experience, what are the main obstacles, the barriers that are presented when you want to implement good regulatory practices? So good regulatory practices are national. It's a national process for each country, and something that we have observed in the countries we are working with. And one of the main problems is the lack of coordination between regulators. In Brazil, we have a famous case, a public case between Anvisa and Inmetro. Inmetro is the metrology authority in the country, and Anvisa is the sanitary vigilance agency. And in Anvisa, you have procedures that are model for the world. It's impressive to see the good regulatory practices they implement. And Inmetro also has advanced procedures, but in our sector, we have a specific case where there is a gap between a good regulatory practice procedure one of the agency has, and the agency sends it to Inmetro and Inmetro to Anvisa, and we don't have an analysis of regulatory impact being concluded. So that kind of, I'm giving you this example because I feel more comfortable talking about a Brazilian case because I work for it with it closer, but it's something that we see in other regions as well. When there is a gap between 2 or 3 regulators and the good regulatory practice process doesn't conclude because of that gap. And at the end, it can result that we can't import important equipment for a hospital because of that gap in a process of good regulatory practices. So I believe my first answer would be that the lack of coordination between regulators would be probably the biggest issue when implementing a process of good regulatory practices. Thank you, Renata. We have a final question. Rosa Quiroz says, can you comment the efforts of regulatory cooperation in the level of health authority for countries that have had good results? Well, Renata, I will give you an example of Brazil. And very recent, in the beginning of the pandemic, Brazil has taken a series of measures to accept the evaluation of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum to speed up their process of approval for the equipment and the products they needed for the pandemic. So they used the work of other regulatory agencies, and this is a tangible, clear, and recent example, and we hope they can be capitalized in the following months and years, especially because the pandemic has brought us some lessons on how to do things differently and safely, ensuring the obligations are met in terms of the commitment to the population and the regulatory and legal obligations as well. So of course, we have to go back to the World Health Organization and the most recent recommendation in terms of reliance and the punctual comments on how to do it, because these recommendations help us to go further in a more efficient way. And we have here a comment of Juan Olivares saying that it could be an example of convergence. Yes, this effort where the regulators coincide that there is a series of requirements that are sufficient for them and trust the products that are produced by a certain manufacturer is a process of convergence. Renata, thank you. Thank you all for your participation in this part of the event. Renata, we continue with you to coordinate the second speaker. Thank you. Thank you, Sandra. And now I believe we are going to have a more specific presentation, more aligned with what we were mentioning in the first session with Dr. Claudia Rosas. She is the professional of the Director of Technical Requirements of International Trade, has a bachelor degree by the University of Exam, experience in the public sector and international consultancy, has participated in international negotiations, as well in the process of implementation of the chapters of technical barriers to trade and the special agreements that Peru is a part of. And she leads projects on technical barriers to trade and good regulatory practices and studies on transparency of the measures. So welcome, Claudia. Thank you for your time, the presentation. I'm sure we are very lucky to have you here with us. Thank you, Renata, and all of you who are here. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to share my screen to start the second presentation. Renata has explained a little about the best regulatory practices, the good regulatory practices. And in the second presentation, I'm going to talk about what Peru does inside the technical barriers to trade agreement. Can you see my screen? Yes, we can. So let's start. This presentation is going to cover the 5 points. First, we are going to talk about the technical barriers to trade agreements. We are going to say the principles and disciplines in it. And then we're going to focus on our work in Peru with the TBT committee and the procedures to develop and notify the technical regulations we have in the country. And finally, we are going to talk about the Peruvian portal of technical regulations. And it can be interesting for those who are interested in seeing the technical procedures we have, the compliance standards that we have inside the health industry. So the TBT agreement wants to ensure the regulation, the standards, and the procedures for evaluation of compliance are adopted by the countries and don't create unnecessary barriers to trade. And also the requirements to start in a market shouldn't be more restrictive than they should. Also, they want to recognize the rights of a country to adopt any dispositions regarding to their legitimate objectives, health, safety, labeling, environment, and others. And it stimulates countries to use the international standards when adequate, because if a technical requirement is based on an international standard that is used by the other countries, the premise is that it shouldn't generate unnecessary barriers to trade. So these are the general objectives of the agreement.
As I told you, the reach of this agreement has three types of measurements. The first one are the technical regulations, and they are all of those documents that are created by a regulator in which we have specific characteristics established for a product. What do I mean by specific characteristics? It can be quality, packaging, production or manufacture methods, or even administrative issues that are related directly to the product. And these technical regulations are mandatory. So it needs to be fulfilled so that this product can go into the market. Which ones we have in our country? We have MINSA, we have MINEM, we have Produce. MINEM is for energy and mines, Produce for production, MINAM, the environment ministry, MIDAGRI for agriculture, and others. On the other side, we have the the procedures for evaluation of conformity. In this case, one regulator is going to determine that a product is actually fulfilling and complying with the requirements demanded on technical regulations. So for measures 1 and 2, the specific point or the contact point that we have before the technical barriers to trade agreement and all of the agreements that we have is the Ministry for Foreign Commerce and Tourism. And the third measure that we have on the TBT, technical barriers to trade agreement, we have the standards. So we have official documents that are sent by international organizations. So it can be ISO or Codex. They have specific quality characteristics for a specific product. So it can be packaging, labels, manufacture methods, etc. But this is not mandatory. This is voluntary. In any case, the question would be why use standards and not technical regulations? You can use both, but the standards can be a little bit more demanding than technical regulations. So when it's a little bit more demanding, I'm trying to say that the quality levels are elevated. And when we do that, we increase competitivity of products facing the international market. In this case, in our country, this entity and the focus point for the World Trade Organization is the National Institute for Quality. Just to have a little reminder, we are not including on the TBT government purchasing services and the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And this is only applicable to products and not services. So once this is clear, now we are going to continue and see, as I said, the focus point for everything that is technical barriers to trade and what we're working on mandatory and voluntary compliance. What are the principles and disciplines of the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, the TBT? Well, we have four. Basically, the first one is no discrimination between similar products. The second, and maybe the heart of the agreement, is prevention of unnecessary obstacles to commerce, so that the requirements are not, super restrictive. It's only what is necessary. Harmonization and use of international standards, and also transparency. What do we mean by transparency? We mean that member countries are able to inform to other countries about their normative projects in a timely manner, so that this can be evaluated, they can have comments, and we're able to, fulfill the requirements in time to be able to go into the market. And about transparency, what we're going to check more deeply in this presentation in the future. So what about Peru in the in the committee for technical barriers to trade? Here, of course, we have the agreement, the TBT agreement, and we have the very specific agreements. So the test of specific measures. So on this committee, they can debate what are their concerns about specific concerns of regulations, commercial laws, and other procedures. And as we said, we have a concern with other members as well, whether it's because they're putting unnecessary barriers to trade, maybe they were notified in time, maybe they're not harmonized with all the other international organizations, etc. So to this date, we have over 500 PCEs. So this is very important on the TBT agenda. And the second aspect, which is fundamental, is stressing the application of the TBT agreement. So we want to listen to the proposal that we have in terms of transparency, applying standards, conformity evaluation, and good regulatory practices. If I remember well, on the last committee, we heard proposals on the notification forms for TBT and how to teach members to use them in a better way. And this is what I'm also going to show you guys in this presentation, so that the information is all smooth and the same. So we want to use the same codes, the same system, or for example, we want the texts that are they're together. The texts for technical regulations are in one of the official languages of the World Trade Organization, which is English, Spanish, and French, and having a better understanding on what we have with the notification and etc. So all these proposals are being presented on the TBT committee, so that we're able to evaluate these proposals and have future decisions and recommendations based on the application of the agreement. What are the benefits for this TBT committee? Here we can see that, after the pandemic, since we have the pandemic, it has been virtual. So few people are there on site, but not a lot of people. Everything has been done virtually, and people have been participating virtually because of COVID-19. As I was saying, what are the benefits that the OTC, the TBT committee has? Participating actively on this committee, what is this going to bring in terms of benefits? Biggest transparency and change of information. So for example, if you have questions on specific technical regulation, or the expiration date, which products are included in that technical regulation. So we usually just review the consultations, and you can ask questions. You can bring your concerns, specific commercial concerns, without having to go to the solution of differences in the World Trade Organization. So if you have a specific commercial concern, you can listen to arguments from both sides, and if both sides agree that this is solved, this concern was solved, this information was coherent, and at this point we feel like there's no other question about it, then we can just close that topic, and we don't have to elevate it to a different solution in the WTO. So also sensibilization on the use of international standards. This is very important as well on the TBT agreement, because if technical regulations are aligned with international standards that are broadly used by the members of World Trade Organization, then the technical regulation wouldn't be restricting commerce, wouldn't be imposing requirements that are more restricted than necessary. Also, what's another benefit? Resolution of commercial concerns. As I said, maybe it's not going to be solved strictly in the committee itself, but of course we can have bilateral meetings where both parts can speak in an informal way, per se, and then it can be solved that way. And this is, of course, we can present a PCE. We can do this in the committee, in the committee. So these are the benefits that we have of participating actively on this committee, and this is what Peru has been doing in the past few years. Now, for Peru, inside the TBT, we have presented so far 204 notifications. We have a growing tendency at a world level that we are going to notify more and more what are the technical regulations, projects, and the sensibilization on transparency, and Peru has been paying attention to that, and we know of a lot of our commitments, not only at a World Trade Organization level, but also of the entire community, the Indian community. And we are always notifying and being very respectful with our commitments and transparency. So far, we have 204 notifications on TBT measures, technical barriers of trade. On our specific commercial concerns, Peru has had 9 PCEs so far. So Peru has brought this concern to another member, and it has raised 7 specific commercial concerns. So members have told us, we had 7 kind of questions about the measures that Peru has. And in the committees, this commercial concern that we have is about the nutritional labels that we have actually so far. So this is a concern, for example, that has been recurrent on the last committees, and that we are always talking about it and evaluating it. Talking about the system of solving differences in World Trade Organization, Peru has participated in 4 cases, has been demanded in 6, and as third party in 19 cases. So in total, we have reclaims for 2 cases, and we weren't demanded, and as a third party we were in 11 cases. So in most of the cases that we participated in, the different solution is on the TBT agreement. Now, what I would like to focus is transparency more than anything. And I would like to explain a little bit of how the procedure for elaboration and notification of technical regulations and our international commitments, and also how we manage notifications that come from us from other countries. So as we know, on the TBT agreement, everyone has to announce in a publication in a timely manner their intention of introducing a new technical regulation or a new evaluation procedure for conformity. In the case of TBT agreement, it's not as simple. So it says that it has to be in a timely manner stage. So according to the recommendations of the TBT committee, these steps would be translated into 60 days. So in a timely manner, I mean 60 days for everyone to give comments on the norm, and 6 months so that it can actually be applied. This technical regulation can be applied. This is so that companies can adapt the products to those requirements. This is for technical regulations and for PECs. And for standards, we should publish the program every 6 months, where we need to have the new norms and the ones that want to be used, the new norms that are going to be used in an official publication. So here, in our case, we have the normalization program that is always public and it's always published. So what is the notification procedure according to the World Trade Organization? So first, we propose a measurement, we publish a warning, and we notify the other members of WTO. Then we can distribute a lot of copies of the text. Then we can see the notification. Then we get to the end of the deadline to present observation, and we're going to examine observations. So here we usually have a minimum of 60 days between notification and the presentation, the final presentation, to deliver the observations that we may have related to a technical regulation. So the minimum deadline is 60 days. So this is the recommendation that we received from the World Trade Organization. Now, after examining their observations, we adopt the measures, we publish it, and it starts working. So between point 8, which is published, and 9, which is actually going into work, the deadline that we have is minimum 6 months, so that the companies can have their products and new requirements at this time. But what happens in our case? In our case, these deadlines that we have been seeing here, the ones we saw here, it's not like they're optional or recommendations. These ones have to be fulfilled, yes or yes, because Peru is part of the Andean community, which is also with Colombia, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And what does this decision 827 says? The member countries of CAN should have a minimum 60 days in the calendar deadline for presenting observations, and technical regulations should start working in at least 6 months. So precisely so that this can happen and we can have enough time to review. As I said, this is a suggestion at this level, but for Peru, it's mandatory. So we need to have at least 60 days and at least 6 months for it to start working. After that, I would like to present a little bit what is the procedure for the notification of this technical regulation. First, a regulator is going to have a draft or rough copy of this technical regulation. Then Mincetur is going to evaluate this regulation and see if it has any unnecessary obstacles to commerce. How do we see this? We see if it's based on international standards, we compare it to other technical elements of the region, and if it's, we can compare it to United States, Europe as well. If there are similar requirements, if, or if maybe they're too restrictive, that's what we're going to do. We're going to check with the specialists and the technicians that work closer to the regulator. So for example, the MISA specialists can do this. Then we do this consultation and we evaluate if, this is more restricted than normal. If there is an obstacle, if we identify that there's an obstacle, we request the regulator to please recreate the technical regulation, given that it could generate some blocks to the commerce. If there's no obstacle, then we can recreate this to the focal point of notification. So in this case, Mincetur. Mincetur is going to notify the project of the technical regulation to WTO, CAN, and all commercial associates as well, in a bilateral way. Why bilateral way? Because all of our commercial agreements all have a technical barriers to trade chapter, and we all have to have considerations based on identifying bilaterally, so on both sides, a new TBT measure or new technical regulation, for example. And then, according to the CAN standard, we have a minimum of 60 days. Then after we go these 60 days for comments, we have the scenario. If there are comments, the regulator has to evaluate how important they are and incorporate those comments received and respond to them. How do we evaluate if they are valid? Well, you need to evaluate if the suggestions that we received from other countries or even from the own representatives of the Peruvian sector if they're compatible to the legitimate goal that we want to pursue, that the technical regulation has. So if there are specific modifications or requirements, the technical regulations should be notified again. So we're going to go back to step 2, which was specifically that the Institute has to evaluate if this technical requirement with new regulations would present any unnecessary obstacle to commerce. If there are modifications that are not, substantial for form, if it's just like number, change of word, something like that, just wording, we can, if they give us an example, we can publish the answer on the Mincetur webpage. And this takes us to the next scenario. So if there are modifications or no comments, then we go back to the countersign and the approval from Mincetur. After that, the technical regulation is published on the El Peruano publication, and it's going to be active in at least 6 months from this procedure. So this is what we usually do. Now, this is while, the regulations that we have. And what happens with the notifications of the technical regulations of other countries? Well, Mincetur is the focal point, as we know. So through e-ping, which Renata explained, it's a very interesting tool that we have. And I back up her recommendation as well. And please take a look at the page for e-ping so you can check how it works. So on Sundays, we get all notifications of all WTO members. So on the first days of the week, between Monday and Wednesday, we try to publish all the notifications from our commercial partners in the notification portal that we have as Mincetur. I will show you guys as well. After that, after they are already uploaded to the portal, everyone that is subscribed to the portal is, so everyone is going to get a notification. Then it's the sector of your interest. So if you're interested in the health sector, you're going to get all the notifications for the technical regulations that are related to the health sector, whether it's medical devices, in this case, medical devices, as well as cosmetics. In other cases, we have sanitary, hygiene products, etc. So you select what you want.
Nosotros hacemos un análisis de las
Besides,
notificaciones.
we make an analysis to understand the notifications, and if we understand there could be some commercial impact, we make a report. It's a very short one, and we analyze the technical alignment, we write very briefly the requirements, and we analyze the economy, so the trend for that market, the products for that sector, and then we send the reports to the interested sectors, the public sector, the regulators, or the private sector. And then we request comments. If there are comments through the reports or the notifications, we receive them inside a deadline. It's important to make sure that the deadlines are very clear. And all the comments and observations of technical alignments have to be well-based. So it can be technically or legally based, but they have to be very consolidated because we send the comments to the focal point of the member country that has issued a notification. So we have to have support. And then we request them to take into consideration the comments before the notification of the technical requirement in their final form. It can be done via email or with our contact point on the other country to be able to coordinate the technical requirement. And that's how we address the notifications coming from other countries. So this is the form for you to submit comments. Here is an example of organic production. So basically what you have to do is put the name of the organization, a public or private one, the dependence, and about the notification, the member that is notifying, and the name of the project of the notified regulation, the code, and the justification. You have here the text of the project of the regulation. So here's an attachment about active substances. And so what's the change or the addition? What we have to add, for instance, in this case, and the justification. So why it should be added or changed. And it's technical. So this is one example of how we expect the comments to be submitted for the notifications that you consider should have some change. And now I would like to present the portal of technical regulations in Peru, and we are going to address the page. In this portal, what we have is a good practice of the segment implemented together. And because of the cooperation with the US in the commercial agreement framework between US and Peru, and allowed us to compile the technical regulations in one place, so users and stakeholders can access this portal and have all the technical regulations that are effective and all the information they may need. Besides this technical requirements, the technical regulation portal has an inventory of all the notifications related to the TBT agreement, and you have to add the text, and you can review the limit deadline for you to send your observations. So let me present the website now. Let me just swap my screen. And now you can see the web page. And so this is the page for the Peruvian technical regulations. Let me zoom in. And we are going to go to the inventory tab and the Peruvian technical regulations, where you can look for the regulation you want by regulating agency, for instance, like Ministry of Health, the kind of device. And here I want to mention that most of the technical regulations are published in our country, but if there is a standard that has specific characteristics about a product and is basically the definition of a technical regulation, doesn't matter under which document it was published or if it has the name of a technical regulation or not. So anyway, it is going to meet all the international standards that we had, the commitments that we have, including our bilateral agreements. So you can look for the type of device. If you know the title, you can put it here, the date it was submitted, the kind of vigilance, like customs control, market vigilance, and you can choose by product. I'm going just to use MINSA, Ministry of Health, and start the survey. And you can see up until the date, you have 33 regulations that are effective in the Ministry of Health. And you can have, for example, this one, the technical documentation, the manual of good practices for distribution and transportation of pharmaceutical, medical device products, and sanitary products. So here you have this manual that defines a set of minimal mandatory practices to maintain the quality and integrity of the products in all the aspects of distribution and transportation. So here, when you click, you are going to see a summary. So the legal advice, the legal device, the title, the summary, the attachments, and the content as it was published in the Peruvian official publication, the regulating entity, the Ministry of Health, and the supervising entity, the general direction, and then the kind of control, it's market vigilance, the effective date, the application use, reference to international or technical standards or other documents, and at the end you have the contact. So if I have any doubt in terms of the application of this technical regulation, I can use this email, and here I can contact the Ministry of Health. So here I can see the files. And don't worry with the links, they are in the presentation, but anyway, I'm going to leave them all on the chat for you, so you can follow it yourself. Very well, so I sent to all of you. And so we are going to have this document. So how the regulation was published in the Peruvian official publication document. This is one example of the 33 technical regulations that we have under the Ministry of Health. And now we are here in inventory. We have the technical regulations, the Andean technical regulations in terms of technical devices and hygiene. So these are the ones that the Andean technical regulations. We have like cosmetics and hygiene products. And then we have here in inventory notifications. And here you have a free page, it's public. And if you want to receive weekly alerts, I would ask you to send us an email on this email address I'm going to write on the chat. So now the link's going to work, and if you want to receive the notifications weekly for the health sector, I would ask you to write to the following email address. So otc@mincetur.gov.p. So here you can see, you can write the entity you are from and what notification you want to receive. We have several sectors here. You have like food, construction, environment, plastic, organics. So we have here, for instance, the human health for cosmetics, pharmaceutical, and all that. So let's see what notifications we have received for human health. You can choose keywords like masks or something like that. You can click search, and you can choose per country or commercial block. And you're going to see all the lists of notifications. For instance, in Korea, you have an amendment of the standard criteria for medication fabrication. Or for the UK, you have the update of medical devices, or South Korea, you have something in terms of collocation and management of single identifiers of medical devices. And the final date for adding comments is October 24, 2021. And here you can download the notification. So the format is the same. In this case, it's in English, and gives us a code, the date of the notification, and the following. The responsible agency, in this case, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety in Korea. So the products that are covered, medical devices, description of the content. So it says that the responsible agency is amending the this aspect of the medical device regulation with the objective of changing the information available for the consumer about labeling. And there is a date, a final date for comments, 60 days from notification. And finally, in item 11, you are always going to have a link that is going to send you directly to the original version of the text. In this case, it's in Korean. So we translate it and we use other languages. It's something that we have discussed a lot because we receive, we have a rule that when you use the language for notification, it has to be in one of the three languages, English, French, or Spanish. There is no mandate specifically for the texts that are attached. So here we follow the rules, so we translate the text or we ask the Korean authority for the text in English. You can have here, let's see another one. This one is from Ecuador about medical devices, just to show you how it would look like in Spanish. So you have the project of reform for storage, distribution, and transportation of pharmaceutical and medical devices for human use. So let's see the form in Spanish now. So likewise, you have the code, the date of the notification, who is the responsible body, the subsecretary of quality, the products that are covered, so pharmaceutical products and medical devices for human use, the title, the number of pages. And so if you have a partial change for this content, the objectives that has to do with information for the consumer and labeling, and item 11, sorry, before that, 60 days to send notification. And finally, in the final part, you are going to have a link that will lead you to the original document. So here, this one is in Spanish, and this is the purpose of technical regulation and change, as mentioned by the Ecuador authority. So as I said, if you would like to receive the weekly alerts, you can use the email I wrote on the chat, and you can introduce yourself, indicate what entity you are part of, and what notifications you would like to receive. And then you will receive a form number. And after that, you are subscribed to the inventory of notifications. You are going to receive all the notifications you subscribed for. So this is what I had to present. I hope my presentation was clear and was useful. And if you have any questions, you can write on the Q&A box. Thank you. Thank you, Claudia, for your presentation. It is impressive and very detailed, and we do have many questions. So I'm sorry for the following panel, but we have to take the opportunity that you are here. And if you could answer the shortest way the questions, because you have lots of them, so you can do it two by two maybe. So the first one is how to proceed when you identify the technical regulations to obtain the sanitary registration of health products are not in line with international standards. And the second is there an established flow in case when you identify technical barriers to trade in the sector of health for imported products? Well, so to answer both questions, when we observe there is a barrier or that there's some lack of harmony with international standards, the premise is that technical regulation should be aligned to international standards. So there is no unnecessary technical barriers to trade, but our technical regulation has to be harmonized. That is, if it's not, you have to understand the reasons why the international standards may not apply to the context of a country or to the association to be able to reach the legitimate objective. So if it's not harmonized, we have to understand why there may be reasons, and the agency behind it may have a justification for that. And the second question about, oh, sorry. So the first question is, well, how to proceed? So for the first question, if there is a lack of harmonization, it doesn't mean there is an unnecessary technical barrier to trade. You have to evaluate. And as user, if you observe there is a technical barrier to trade, you can communicate with Mincetur on our email. We always have a close coordination with other ministries, so we can assess this lack of harmonization. The second one, and about the established flow in terms of health products and when imported products. So we communicate with MINSA and we have meetings with MINCETUR and MINCEMIT and the party that has issued the concern, and we see a way to solve this concern. But yes, we are always we are working very closely with the regulating agency. And then the next one is by Rina Agüero. To consider that to reach regulatory convergence internationally is necessary to review the regulatory impact of the national legislation. And the next one is by Jessica Carpio. When you have a technical regulation and a necessary obstacle, a necessary technical barrier to trade, what aspects do you consider when evaluating the risks of a product and define the level of restriction applicable to certain product? So for the first question, what I have understood now in the regulation of RIA, which is the impact of regulatory analysis. So technical regulations that are out of the analysis of the technical regulation, it's out of our good practices. So what we do is, with the procedure as I've shown, we try to notify on time and receive the comments of the stakeholders, the audience, the public and private sectors to notify the technical regulations, and also other countries when they issue their regulations. So we make comments and also the information that are compiled in one place with all the technical regulations and notifications. So this is the best practice that we have so far.
En cuanto a la segunda pregunta,
So about the second question now, it says when we have a technical, when one technical regulation becomes an unnecessary obstacle, an unnecessary barrier. So when it's too restricted, we're able to do an evaluation. So first, we would like to check in this evaluation, we want to make sure if this is aligned with other requirements and other technical regulations in the region, or maybe other countries like the United States, Canada, European Union. We get all that information and we have a comparison to be able to really see if it's more restrictive than the other countries. And we check if it's according to international standards. It's not a determining factors in the end, but it's important to, account for it. And also we do an economic analysis. So what is the impact in our analysis? That is kind of what we do. And what are the elements that you consider to evaluate the risks of a product and determine the level of restriction. That will depend on the sector or the product itself that you would like to regulate. And this level of restriction is a factor that specialists will analyze. In our case, would be MINSA or TIHIN. Okay, it's actually an analysis very related to each case, right? So we end up having general, we can't say general elements because it will be case by case. There are two questions from Juan Olivares. Peru has received a specific commercial concern, or if it was demanded by any law related to pharmaceutical products and medical devices. And the second question from the same person is, in addition to the technical regulation that is approved, are the ones that are approved by ministry resolution, or do you also have the supreme decrees related to the specific commercial concern? I'm not sure. We have received some PCEs about it. I'm not sure, but I believe we can go over it, and you can check on the World Trade Organization page. There you have all the list of specific commercial concerns. I will also put it in the chat so you guys can check whenever you're able to. So in this case, I can't give you an answer for sure. And about if the technical regulations that we have are the ones that are approved by ministry resolution or the supreme decrees. Most of the technical regulations are published on supreme decrees. However, this is not a restriction. So if it's approved by the ministry, you can't do the other way. No. Every normative document that has specific characteristics established for a product and it's mandatory and that is inside the technical regulation characteristic is a technical regulation. So it has to follow all the international commitments, notification, transparency, and see that it's not too restrictive or it has any divergencies and it has any discrimination in it. So this document has to be published. And if it is within the definition for technical regulation, it has to follow all the procedures. Okay, the last two questions that we have on the Q&A. How do you notify MINCETUR when the regulator has drafts for the technical regulation that has goals that are unnecessary for commerce? And what to do when technical regulations are published without room for observations in the draft, or when the communication of the justification is not considered? Okay, MINCETUR, as I said, is always in constant communication with the regulators. Now we are actually having a lot of capacitations on that and all the procedures that we have to follow for technical regulations notifications. So in our case, we always have a contact point for each one of the regulators. And when they go to have a draft or technical regulation, they are telling us, they already let us know since that's the procedure. And when they send us the draft or the rough copy, we usually tell them, oh, we have this barrier to trade, can we have meetings? And we try to make a very fluid communication on that side. About the second question, though, if we're going to have notifications in which we don't include room for comments, these can be urgent notifications. I think Peru has one. In the case for community, well, with the pandemic, we didn't have specific regulations for creating those. So we tried to get it as fast as possible. It was an emergency notification because of the pandemic, and we didn't give enough time for comments because it was in an emergency situation. When we have an emergency notification, okay, but if it's a normal notification and we see that they didn't give room for comments or they didn't account for the comments that we have sent, first we try to solve it bilaterally with both sides, with the party that has notified, and we go to the focal point. We ask for the explanation. Why didn't you consider the comments from Peru? Why didn't you give a deadline for comments? And if we see that there's no answer or there's no solution about it, in that case, we're going to evaluate the need of having a specific commercial concern in place. Okay, thank you so much, Claudia. I think we've covered everything. I think we've covered all the questions on the Q&A. Thank you so much for your presentation. Sandra, I think we haven't finished, right, Claudia? I think we have 2 more questions. Sorry, Sandra. Thank you so much, Renata. We do have more questions, but we know that the time is short. And again, we would like to say thank you and sorry to the panels on the next session. Just a few additional questions. For example, it's clear that Peru is, committed to implementing these good practices, but it's also clear that Minsetur can have visibility that one of the regulatory agencies doesn't have enough resources to be able to do the correct and full implementation of the good regulatory practices to be able to really have all these legal compliance being fulfilled. And somehow there is a mechanism so that we can avoid and generate regulations that don't follow this process, and we can search alternate paths for this. There is the possibility that we're going to delay the publishing of a technical regulation until the moment that we can have enough resources to execute the process correctly and fully. Well, I would ask for you to explain the question again, please. I believe what you're asking is to be able to apply procedures when we have the technical regulations. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, not only that, but the entire process of publishing for comments, notification to the World Trade Organization, obviously having generated RIA. So the entire process that we have before, and also everything that we do with our RIA. Okay, so whenever we can do that, but we have to respect the deadlines and international commitments that we have. For example, the Andean community. So we have 60 days for comments and 6 months minimum for it to actually be active. So if that is being respected, okay, yes, we would be able to apply other mechanisms, and that could be for good regulatory practices, because I understand that that's something very important. But the possibility is always there. But the condition is that we respect the international commitments we have. In this case, it would be the deadlines. Okay, and if we don't have resources to follow through with the process, is it valid to, suspend the generation of the technical regulation? Well, whenever the regulator considers it so, it will depend on the regulator, basically. Okay, and in this sense, for example, if you see that they don't have enough resources, can Minsetur ask them to apply good reliance practices? So instead of having the entire process, and we can trust the decision of other regulators, maybe? Well, what we do, as I said, is a very close-knit coordination with the regulators so that they can try to have a technical regulation. For them to do that, they need to have an entire previous study and identify needs, cost-benefit ratio of the sectors that we'd like to regulate. So Minsetur, basically what it does is it checks the technical part as well, but checking that the technical regulation is going to actually fulfill the commitments that we have at an international level, that it is applicable for national as well as international products. If it can, for it to be harmonized with the international standards, and that we can have publishing in time, comments in time, so that we don't have unnecessary requirements for commerce and trade. So we don't really look at the technical part that much, or we go to our regulator and we say, no, don't publish this, or remove this. This is going to be for each regulator. What we make sure is that the entire process is in compliance with our international commitments, that it's transparent, and that one way or another, applying these good regulatory practices have transparency, and that it's included, and we have the opinion of the entire public and private sectors. Thank you. Renata? Excellent. I think we did everything. Sorry, Claudia, we asked you a bunch of questions, but thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I am sorry to the next panelist. This was great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Perfect, thank you so much. Well, now for our next discussion table on the discussion that we have for Peru, I would like to welcome Dr. Alberto Castro. He is a lawyer for the Pontifical University in Peru. He has a doctorate in public law on the lower countries. He's an expert in management of public policies for simplification of administration, and he has a broad experience on the public sector. He was an assessor as well on the presidency for ministers in Peru. He has represented the Peruvian state on the Committee of Regulatory Policy and Public Governance of OCDE in Paris. He works in the law university, and he has specialty in public law. Alberto, thank you so much for your participation. You can start, and again, sorry about the delay. Thank you. Sorry, Alberto, I think your microphone is closed. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me now? Well, it's a little bit, the connection is not working very well. Hopefully we'll get better. Now? Is it okay? Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you. Perfect, Sandra. Thank you so much. Well, now, effectively, what we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about the structure of the regulation that we have and the evolution of the sanitary regulation in Peru. We're going to present this specifically for the regulation of medical devices. We're going to have a general view of this field. And now we're going to go specifically, for example, for the regulation of medical devices for an in vitro diagnosis. We have two other panelists that are great, that are going to be here with us. We have Jaime Torres and Janet Tataje. They're going to be here with us today. So before I am able to welcome Janet, I would just like to mention that it's important that the sector standards are going to continue following all the regulatory questions that we have. And not only we're going to make sure that we're going to have the participation of all stakeholders, but also the access to the citizens and medical technology as an opportunity and quality. And as we mentioned as well, the procedures that need to be the competent authority to be able to have these authorizations, for it to be aligned with the international standards, so that we don't have any bureaucratic problems, and we don't do anything else than building a more access to citizens related to treatment and medical attention. So with that being said, now I'm going to go over to Janet Tataje. Janet, she has over 17 years of experience in the pharmaceutical business. She's the technical director and quality manager and regulatory issues for Roche. So she's the coordinator of in vitro diagnosis, and she's also on the Consalud committee on the Chamber of Commerce. Please, Janet. Oh, we're going to start with me, actually. I'm going to share my screen.
Vamos a comenzar con Jaime.
Sí. Okay, we're going to start with Jaime. Okay, sorry, Jaime. I'm so sorry, Jaime. Okay, so the corresponding presentation. Jaime Torres. He works with the pharmaceutical area as well. He is He's actually graduated in pharmaceutical law. He works on the regulatory efforts. He's a partner of radio,
para Latinoamérica de
and he works specifically for Latin America on Medtronic. He's a technical director in Peru, secretary on the subcommittee of medical devices, president of the material and medical devices sector in Comsalud, and also on the regulatory sector for national and international companies. Jaime, please go ahead. Thank you so much, Alberto. Sorry about that. Don't worry. You can please confirm if you can see the presentation. Yes, I can. Thank you so much, Alberto, for the presentation. Good afternoon to all participants. Well, the intention of this review that we're going to go over today and the comments that I'm going to bring on this presentation are related to an analysis on medical devices. And the first topic that I would like to, when I was thinking of this presentation, I was thinking that I would like to bring this topic is medical devices. If they're just a social well-being, what is it? Is it an economic asset, social asset? What is it? Well, I believe that when we're developing regulation in the country, we have, when we had this regulation, we had this in different ways. I believe that the device is a social and economic asset, and we have to recognize both characteristics. It is a social asset because it needs to make sure that, because health is a universal right to all of us. So every citizen in Peru should have access to medical devices in terms of technology, the newest technologies, and also on the private side, on the economic side, also recognizing that, the commercialization of these products and medical devices in general allow for us to have, more development of technologies. So finally, this also impacts patients. This also allows for us to have these products in the market, these products that are going to help everyone's health. Another important topic that I would like to bring here is that the pharmaceutical products are different than medical devices. When we talk about medical devices, I know that the audience here is very broad, so I would like to just mention that pharmaceutical products are what we know as pills, vaccines. And when we talk about medical devices, we're talking about stitches, ventilators, which in this pandemic were critical and they were very much used, and that, can monitor vital signs, and that we can have this type of use in general.
So we have a broad range of medical devices like pacemakers and MRI equipment. So we have the perspective that there should be a different collaboration from all the points of view. And soon we see that we have the General Law of Health number 26482 of July 1997 defines that in chapter 3 that it develops the standard, the regulation for pharmaceutical products, 26 articles. So it's very broad, very well detailed. And in chapter 4, we talk about food, drinks, cosmetic products, inputs, equipment for medical and chirurgical products, odontologic, and you have 7 articles to regulate all that is not a pharmaceutical product. And here you consider the automatic registration would have a term of 7 days to have a document of authorization. And so they state the regulator agency to respond within that term of 7 days. So it would be necessary to have just a certificate of free commercialization or of export, and then the sanitary authority should have a position and would have as a counterpart this easy registration and later control in the market. The law was regulated by regulation, where you have what others in the description would be the medical devices. So this is the first comment I have on this law. If you have the law in terms of access, it doesn't give visibility, it doesn't review the health impact. You had the later control in the market of everything that was presented during the process of request before the sanitary authority. And there was a control in the market of the products that would meet the requirements. And in case of medical devices, because of the instruction chain, it would be harder. And you don't have all the resources to cover a country that is broad and diverse in terms of territory. So the other question I would leave is that, are medical devices less important in the sanitary system than the pharmaceutical product? What I mean is, when we get to a medical environment, a hospital, a clinic, the first thing we see are medical devices. From the bed, the stethoscope, all the elements, the syringes, everything that when you get to a hospital or a clinic, you see. So I consider medical devices products very important in terms of health, as well as the pharmaceutical products, so they should have the same importance way. So we have evolved, and in 2019 we have a law for pharmaceutical products, as well as medical devices and sanitary products. So in the law, we defined different principles of safety, efficacy, quality, rationality, accessibility, social wellness, and transparency. We also define what medical device is, and importantly, it recognizes the alignments of references. It talks about the RFTS, and also not only from the sanitary authorization, but also the commercialization, and that's where you have the good regulatory practices. In the chapter 14, you have medical devices definitions, and in this case, it aligns to international standards. And it recognizes the reference like the GHFT and the IMDRF that are aligned with regulation 016. And I highlight the 1029 that have more to do with medical devices. In this case, we say the focus of the standard would be safety and efficacy, and would have to measure the access as well. So when there is an impact in access is when you have a standard, a requirement that prevents us, as the panelist mentioned, that prevents access to products. So I believe here our focus would be safety and efficacy, but it would not observe the access part of it. And as I mentioned, because it impacts the requirements, and if it is not aligned with international standards, it impacts the access to medical technology products. And I mentioned as some topics to be revised, the registration per manufacturer versus registration per manufacturing site. The standard defines that the manufacturer is responsible for the whole process of design until manufacturing, and we in Peru have a registration by manufacturing site because, from my perspective, we have the criteria of pharmaceuticals to all the region because the registration is by manufacturer and manufacturing site is on one registration. So it reduces the volume, the administrative volume in the government and private sector. So you have one code, one registration, so you can have more control. Then you have the origin country and manufacturing country, and this is a requirement for taxation and not for the sanitary aspect. So meeting the good regulatory and manufacturing practices is really important. And then you have the analysis certification. So you use it as pharmaceutical products, and for medical devices, there are other documents that can show if the quality of the product is adequate. We also have the products for the risk class 1. So products with higher risk, you have a different expectation, and the same happens to Colombia and Brazil, and depending on the risk class 1, you only have a notification. And in case of mechanisms to evaluate the evolution impact of the regulation in the reference countries and the ways of adoptions, and that's what was said before, the technical regulations, and inside the regulator, you can evaluate the impact of the changing regulations of the reference countries. We are importers as a country, so there are standards that go and support the patient, and it can impact other products. Today, can I give you the example of the regulation of Europe that is impacting the packaging, the use instructions, and soon it will impact the administrative processes locally and the ones we have to mind. And how can we make these processes to be agile enough to reduce the impact on the access to products and the marketing? So this is what I'd like to share with you as a reflection, and so we can move on to Janet now. Thank you. Very well. Let me know if you can see my screen. So first of all, I would like to thank the Coalition and Centra for the opportunity and greet everyone. Here, I'm going to share how we deal with the standard for the IVD in Peru, and how we have the molecular tests and quick tests. And in this sense, we have to consider, why do we have to have a standard change? It's just to ensure the access to new technologies to patients. So here, I will share how the standard had its history. So in Peru, it started in 1997, and so it's 24 years old. When this standard was considered, it considered the requirements at that point in time, and also the ones that were prioritary to ensure the access at that situation. So you see the requirements here. You have technical specifications being considered secondary, and in this classification you have IVD classification and also the certifications that are related, and the subclassification are related here as well. I would like to highlight the importance of the age of the standard because it was put, it was efficient, sorry, it was put in a practice again by saying in 2012 because they said they needed complementary standards. So what would be the current situation now in Peru? How are we managing the regulatory process for that kind of product? So as mentioned, we have the DS010, but some criteria are DS016 that are the guidelines for us for medical devices. And then you have the IVD medical devices, and you also have international standards like the ISO 13485, and also considerations for the labeling that are very good for that kind of product. But also it's important to recognize and mention that the difference from what Jaime has already mentioned for medical devices, when you consider international standards of IMDRF, in vitro diagnosis, it wasn't considered because it's not to have a test for HIV and one for cholesterol. So here we have to have different scrutiny on how to manage the level, the risk levels. It's important also to consider the changes, and you don't consider bigger or smaller changes. So you can generate a great amount of bigger changes, but when you consider, for instance, for the professional using the product, you have to consider other populations of other countries. And so the consequence here would be a delay in the availability of the product for public access for the Peruvian population. And another point it generates is the high workload for the administrative workload for GMED and the companies. So what we thought in this case, and something we want to contribute with in the future, is that we have to look forward, considering an integrated standards that would cover 010, the international references like IMDRF, and would talk about definitions and risk classifications for IVD and other standards and international standards regulations that would talk about product approval, the emergency use, and decrease like the ones we have established as DM and DMDIV, and as well as technical vigilance and everything related to it. So in the future, we want to have a standard that would be modern, based on international standards, and would allow the access to the products to the patients. So to understand a little how to build a standard and why it's needed, we have to consider the ones, the change boosters. What generates change in the standards, and we have to take into consideration things that IMDRF have considered. So the need of adaptation to the technological and scientific progress. We can't be delayed in that. And we also know that there are products pharmaceutical products, medications that are worked together with devices and IVD. And we also have companion diagnostics. In this case, we evaluate the efficacy of a pharmaceutical or biological product in the patient. In this case, we have the case of Epsitin, where you have a company and you monitor the efficacy of a product. Also, it's important to ensure why to make a change, because we have seen a lot in the pandemic. We have changed health systems to our houses with special care to patients that couldn't go to hospitals or clinics because of the COVID situation. And so it leads us to consider technological changes and the digitalization of health, using New Health and mHealth, which are health applications that we have over our mobile phones, and it helps us with patient treatment and monitor some parameters. We also have to understand the changes that happen in the regulatory level, like the IVDR in Europe, because in Europe you had a guideline, and since last year, this change allows the countries in the European community to have a standardized way to work with the criteria. And another point that generates points is globalization, because the exchange of information and technology drives us and allows us to apply integrated standards that would lead to the convergence. And two important practices that we have to take into consideration when we are going through a change or implement a standard change are the good regulatory practices and good reliance practices. And so we can go further in the concepts. And in this sense, we start thinking what would be the challenges we would have to face in Peru to implement a standard for IVD. And so, even though in Peru we have some challenges, I should tell you that in other countries, we have some that are using more modern or more agile changes. As well as you can see in Colombia, you have the regulatory framework for post-approval changes, and in Ecuador, you have a kind of reliance. They don't call it like that, but it's an expedite process for approving products in categories 1 and 2 that obtain quicker approval of the relevant authority using reliance as and the trust on what other authority does.
And considering that, we also, to be able to build this regulation, we need to consider elements that are key to have a modern and flexible regulation. They already mentioned it. I'm going to repeat for reliance and recognition. Reliance, as I told you, is this trust, we can say, to be able to adopt what other authority has put forth. And in the case of recognition, is when we have this systemic adoption of one regulatory authority or institution. So this is what allows, as we mentioned, it optimizes resources for the regulator. And other than that, it's not going to lower the standard, but it's going to make the process a little bit easier. Also, good regulatory practices. We have mentioned it a lot to be able to cooperate and to have convergent regulations. Another important topic that we have here that I would like to mention as well is not only for the case of emergencies, but we need to have these quick ways in cases that, like the ones we can present in pandemics, Zika, dengue viruses. Even though it's not a national sanitary emergency, we can act quickly towards those viruses in a quick way to be able to approve this type of product. Also, we have to use data, of the real world, so real world evidence. We have to use the everything that we have to be able to have our regulatory decisions be more accurate. And finally, since we can't separate from technology and digitalization, we are, going very quickly towards digitalization and health. It's very important for us to consider in our regulation programs like the one that FDA is doing related to the pre-certification of softwares, not per type of product, but as a company. So this is very important. And to summarize, this is what is going to make it easier for us to have a modern and flexible regulation. And all of this needs to be done, just like everything that we do and everyone that is in health does, considering our patient. We are focused on the patient to be able to make sure the patient will have access to opportune diagnosis and to be able to have, uninterrupted treatment. Thank you so much. It was short time, so I'm going to leave you my email information if you want to contact me. And if there's time, let's move on to the Q&A. Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet and Jaime. Unfortunately, we asked our moderator because of our time. Now we would like to take this opportunity of first thanking you and thank you for sharing what you did with us. And now, very quickly, I would like to ask you, first of all, thank you for sharing everything that you did and giving us the current situation, the challenges and opportunities that you see. And on that note, what do you consider we can do better as a private sector to be able to better collaborate with DGEMI, to be able to advance in all those topics and to reach the future where we are in terms of regulation for innovative technology to solve the challenges and barriers that we have identified? What can we do better as private sector to be able to help? Well, from my point of view, what we could do as private sector is what we are doing now, promoting this type of spaces for education, for knowledge, and knowing more of how the normative processes are managed in our country, because I think that this is very important topic that we have, not only from the regulators' point of view, but also from the private sector that are on this process, and also being supported and using this as reference. These are international references like good regulatory practices from the health area, reliance practices as well, and with everything that we have in terms of regulations that will be used and what we can use in this process. So that would really help to make it easier for patient access. I think it's important for us to start with those spaces, which are very important for us to be able to reach that conscience level and also a space to be able to continue developing this. Thank you so much, Sandra. And I would like to add, aligned with what Janet said, I would like to, just stress that this space for interaction between all private sector, academy, regulators, this is really, really good, very important, because it does allow for us to put on the table the concerns from all sides. That is one thing. Of course, when we talk about medical devices specifically, we have the challenge of technology moving faster and faster every day. So we're talking about IA. We have all of the developments that we have to evaluate artificial intelligence, robotics, the apps that Janet was mentioning. When we talk about measure, devices, so we're going to the more individual production of medical devices. We have more inclusion. So I think that we have to try to search these spaces where we can present the technology, which is happening all over the world, the main regulators that are developing this type of product, and how we can bring this to our reality. Because if I say, oh, we're a country that mainly imports goods. I don't want to, skip over the fact that we have a lot of people that are working in innovation. We have seen in the pandemic the development of ventilators, and I have the opportunity of being working with people who are creating medical devices and a lot of important devices. And finally, we're able to put them in the market and give access. Unfortunately, some of them didn't happen. They weren't put into the market because we had problems in the manufacture process. And us as a country should not only find how we should incentivize this technology through regulation, but really, push it and help it. Thank you so much, Jaime. We do have a question from our audience. How do you think the representatives should participate in this space of discussion and update? Because we shared that fortunately today they are here. We have a lot of people here from DGMI, and we leave everything open. So subscriptions are open for all the relevant players in the industry. And of course, it is great to have everyone here. And this is the first of a series of events that we want to organize to keep building this knowledge. And we want to make sure that everyone has visibility, and we are making sure that we have the contribution of all the actors on all sides to be able to have these events and keep going deeper with the knowledge that we have, and for this to give us the possibility of having concrete action, because that's it. How do we lead to concrete action that will make sure we're going to improve and make sure everyone has access to medical devices and medical technology, of course, including diagnosis in a very effective way for everyone's benefit. With that, I would like to thank you all so much. Sandro, I would like to invite you to a closing message. Renata, also, if you have anything to say in the closing. And of course, inviting you because tomorrow we're going to be here. We're going to keep going forward in the development of knowledge, and your contribution is fundamental for us to be able to do it. Sandro, please. Thank you so much, Sandra. Now it's the easiest thing. Just say thank you and bye. It was amazing. I think everyone learned a lot, specifically here. I know people that have like 20, 22, 25 years in the market, and we're still trying to learn and regulate. And as Jaime said, their technology is so fast that sometimes we can't reach it. But it's really important for us to have this type of panel so that everyone is participating. We have information from all sides. I'm very happy to be here with all of you and seeing what we can do to be together, because what we don't want is we don't want these devices that are going around with no regulation. We want devices that are well regulated and that can allow access to patients. And everything which is in this sector, I believe that's what we're searching for, because in the end, we are also patients. So I'm also going to thank you. I want to thank Renata, Janet, Jaime, Alberto, who had to go because of the time. Sandra, of course, because you are the one who has led this organization. So yeah, we also have a course tomorrow, but now go over to Renata, who's going to thank you all for being here as well. And thank you so much. And I'm happy we were able to share this together. Well, from my side, I'm also very happy with this first day. Thank you so much, Janet, Jaime, and Sandra for staying with us all morning or afternoon. And I would like to stress something that I think Sandra will agree with me. We never had this many participants in one country, and we never had this many questions. So I'm very happy. Hopefully tomorrow will be the same or even better, because this is really the goal of what we're doing, getting everyone together to talk, to enjoy this opportunity of asking questions, really making demands and comments. And this is really the first event that we want to do with you. Sandra? Thank you so much, Renata. Thank you so much, Sandro. Actually, this is the result of our teamwork. We have the members of our technical secretary of the coalition, members of Comsalud, the members of the coalition, the entire technical team helping us as well. So this is just the result of teamwork. I am honored to be the voice to say everything. I'm very proud of the work that we're doing, and I'm really, really proud of everything that we did, and we were able to get so many people here. Truly, this is the benchmark for all the other ones that we're going to have. Tomorrow, we'll see each other, we'll continue, and thank you so much. You know, we actually went over 30 minutes of our time, but thank you so much for staying, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good day. Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Muchas gracias. Buena tarde.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon.